Good evening, councillors and members of the public. Welcome to this first meeting of the Central Area Planning Committee. I'll just really quickly draw your attention to the fire regulations which are on the screen behind me, and make sure your mobiles are switched to silent if that's okay. I'll move swiftly on to the first item of business, which is the appointment of chairman. To confirm the appointment of Councillor Richard Cole as chairman of the Central Area Planning Committee for the council year 2019-20. Is that agreed? Thank you, everyone.
Second item, appointment of the vice chairman. So to confirm the appointment of Councillor David Else as vice chairman of the Central Area Planning Committee for the council year 2019-2020. Is that agreed? Thank you. Item 3. So can I ask that I can confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 10th of April 2019. Is that agreed? Thank you. So do I sign now or later? Okay, thank you. Right. Amy, any apologies for...
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies from Councillor Christine Baker and Councillor Jan Floyd Douglas.
Do we have to accept that? Do we accept those apologies?
We normally just move on.
We just read them out. No. In the past, we've... Yeah. Item 5, declarations of interest. Amy, are there any declarations of interest?
Thank you, Chairman. Beth Helen Smith, Development Manager, has declared a disclosable pecuniary interest in item B1 and will leave the chamber while that item is considered.
Are there any other declarations of interest that have not been made? No. Okay, thank you. Are there any questions that have been received from members of the public?
None received, Chairman.
Okay. In that case, I'll go to item 8, which there is something to be... Beth, there's an update on government guidance or legislation since the last meeting?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. So it's an update basically regarding the Wealden Heath Special Protection Area. 2 appeal decisions were received last week where the inspector dismissed the appeals based on a lack of clarity about the impact on the Wealden Heath's SPA. Natural England, who are a statutory consultee on development affecting a European site, so an SPA or site of or SAC, have been consulted on the decisions, and the application at Branksome House that is before you this evening is particularly relevant. Natural England have confirmed that taking into consideration the distance of these units from the SPA and the scale of the proposals, these developments would not alone or in combination with other developments cause a significant effect, and that an appropriate assessment would not be required. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Okay. Moving on then, item 9.1. So site inspections arising from this meeting. So just to advise you that in the event of a site inspection becoming necessary as a result of consideration of the applications at this meeting, these will be held on Tuesday, the 9th of July, at a time to be agreed at the meeting. So that's in case we decide later on we need those. Okay. I guess move on to item... Oh, okay, you're going to... Yes. I've asked Amy to introduce the officers since some of us may not recognise the officers. Like me.
I'm Barry Devlin, Planning Solicitor with the Council.
Good evening, I'm Paul McKim, Head of Planning.
I'm Kate Edwards, Principal Planning Officer in the Central and Eastern team.
Evening, I'm Ruth Dovey and I'm Team Leader for Central and Eastern Planning Team.
And I'm Beth Howland Smith, Development Manager. Thank you, Chairman.
Garming Railway Station, station approach, and the proposal is listed building consent for external alterations to allow the provision of altered level at side access door, CCTV and remotely controlled door lock. So you're going to present this, please?
Those members who were on the committee in April will recall that this application was brought before the committee at the April meeting, and it was deferred from that committee for further information. I'll present the case sort of from scratch, as it were, but I'll also sort of highlight what the new information is. And those of you who have been following the case may note that there's been a change of description. But effectively for this site, the applicant has submitted a large amount of information about various proposals for the station, many of which don't come within the remit of this application and so aren't material considerations. But I'll take you through that item by item. And the description has been altered to make it very clear that this application is only for the works to the existing listed building and to the fabric of that building. So here we can see an aerial view of the site. The station building itself is here, and this is the listed building. As you can see here, there is the existing bridge which passes over the railway, and platform 1 with the trains running into central London here. All of the proposed works are around the main station building, which is the adjoining the platform for trains bound away from London. You can see Station Approach Road along here, and we currently are sort of just off the image here in this sort of location. Here's a location, the site plan again. And here we can see the existing station building, which is a listed building, and the various single-storey parts of the building in this area here to the side, which is where the works would predominantly be taking place. And here we can see that area again, just in a closer-up view. And here is the inside of the building, where there are changes proposed to this existing access door onto the platform. Although it's not normally the case for planning applications that internal alterations to existing buildings without a change of use are taken into consideration, because this is a listed building, there are special circumstances which allow us to control what's happening on the inside of the building. So there's an internal elevation of this view later on in the presentation. So here you can see a proposed layout plan. To the side of the existing building, it's proposed that the applicant would erect a building to house a new gate line. However, this does not form part of the application, and it would in effect be carried out as a permitted development work by the railway undertaker. However, where it adjoins the listed building, there is a requirement for listed building consent, because there's no permitted development rights for that. It's in the area of the existing disabled access car park, and the applicant is also proposing, again, not as part of the listed building consent application, but they're also proposing to resite that. So here we can see one of the new images which has been submitted by the applicant, following on from the previous deferral at committee in a response for requested additional information. One of the key works and parts of the proposal is the installation of a new CCTV unit on the external front elevation of the building. So you can see here, the colours unfortunately haven't come through very well on the screen, but just at this point here, there is the red CCTV unit which they will be providing, would be sited. In addition, it's the return wall to the platform currently has an access doorway through, which would be behind the proposed structure, and to level the access around there, they'd be taking the ground down slightly around that doorway, which would be made good in accordance with the levels that they're proposing. And here we can see an internal elevation of the booking hall where the existing entrance door onto the platforms would be shut, and a system installed so that in an emergency there's always a release for the lock on the door from within the ticket office itself. And as you can see, the red lines here are the conduits where the cabling would be sited. And the material considerations here are solely in relation to the impact of the proposals, which I've described, on the listed building and its significance. Following on from the publication of the committee report, we've received an additional representation from a neighbour or interested party, which you will have seen on the update sheet I've just circulated. That in effect raised issues which were covered in other representations, and also raised a query that there would be no public benefits to the proposal. However, in planning terms, as there is not considered to be any harm to the significance of the listed building, there is no requirement for a harm to be balanced by a public benefit. And that's everything on the case. Thank you.
Right, and as you said, quite a lot of the information which is contained in the application is not material to this evening's consideration, which is purely on the matter you've got there, which is the listed building issue. Okay, thank you. Okay, in that case, we have two members of the public who will be speaking. The first one, well, I'll say it's 4 minutes, definitely, and we'll be noting the time, and I'll give you a warning when we get to 3 minutes, so you have 1 minute left. So there's two speakers. First is Richard Ashworth, who's objecting to the application. Secondly, Liz Vestry, who is supporting the application. So is Richard Ashworth here?
Yeah, I think given the clarification as to what is germane and what is not, I have nothing to say.
Mr. Ashworth has said that given the clarification that was offered earlier, then he doesn't propose to speak on the basis it's unnecessary. So in that case, we'll move on to Liz Vestry. Is she here?
She is, yeah. I'm happy to thank the planning officer for all her representations. I'm happy to come and speak again, but it would be repeating very much what she said.
Well, given that we have a lot of members here were not here the last time around. Did you speak at the last meeting?
I didn't.
Well, it's up to you. You have the opportunity to speak if you wish. I'll leave it in your hands. Yep.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Liz Vestry. I'm the Head of Commercial Projects for South Western Railway. Automatic ticket gates are an important part of the railway infrastructure, and Godalming Station is one of the 13 stations that the Department for Transport has asked us to install automatic ticket gates across our network. The scheme, we are optimistic, is got very many public benefits and social benefits, and similar schemes have been installed across the country, including on other listed buildings. The gates have been fully designed and consulted with our rail user groups in the area, and yeah, sorry, there's not a lot to say really. Kate's really said it for us, but please, if anyone's got any questions about the gates, please let me know. Okay.
Okay. Right. So we have the recommendation we have to decide upon is that subject to condition.
Members to comment.
well, I was going to ask them, I was going to say, let's just read out the recommendation and ask people to comment. I wasn't going to go straight to the vote. But okay, you've got the recommendation in front of you. So are there any comments that any member would like to make? Councillor Follows.
Thank you, Chair. So I think I'm one of the two members that were here. I'm glad Peter is about to speak as well. We had some concerns with this, and I just want to clarify that the main issues that we had concerns about are permitted development, and they've changed the description so that we effectively cannot discuss them in the context of this planning application. Can I just ask that question before I go on?
Yes, the description was changed at my request because I didn't feel it fully described what we had before us. And I think regardless of the description, it's a listed building consent application, so other issues as raised in the representations, particularly in relation to the access to the other platform, aren't material to the determination and weren't with the previous description.
I will just briefly say I do have a lot of sympathy for a number of the representations, as I did explain more clearly in the previous version of this committee. And I would say that we're looking at the public good as the supporter of the proposal was, I think, about to describe. The access from the other side of the station is going to cause a number of residents a great deal of concern. So although we can't discuss it as part of this planning application, I would just urge South Western Rail to do as much as possible to ensure unrestricted access from the other side, particularly with the new housing being proposed at Oxford Park and the people coming down from New Way, which was not part of the passenger numbers study that you were looking at previously, is my understanding. I'm going to stop now so other members can talk about the specifics, and I might come back later after hearing that. But yeah, that's where I am on that particular bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Could I just ask a question, first of all? There are, in the picture as shown on page 9, a series of bollards which are to be put in front of our listed building here. Is that so? And if so, is there a loss of parking spaces? There are 2 or 3 parking spaces for temporary short stops, dropping off people and so on and so forth. Are they to be lost, as you understand? I know it's not quite part of what we're asking, but the bollards are of interest.
Yes, the applicant is proposing as part of a package of works to put in bollards there, but they would be carried out as a permitted development work and therefore wouldn't require listed building consent. As a railway provider, Network Rail has quite an extensive allowance of permitted development rights, so things that they can carry out on their property. In terms of parking spaces, from memory at the site visit, that's an area where there aren't parking spaces where the bollards would be, but the applicant is effectively proposing I suppose a replanning of the car park to an extent that they could provide disabled parking elsewhere within the car park. But that's by way of background, and it's information which has been submitted with this application, but again, it's not a material consideration in relation to the determination of the listed building impact.
Thank you. I have to say, Mr. Chairman, that the spaces that are in question here are not permanent parking spaces or long-term. They are just short-term drop-offs where you can park for 10 minutes, pop in and wait for somebody to come off the train, and off you go again. That will be lost, and that will have a terrific impact on people using the station. However, I understand it's not part of this. I would have thought the bollards being placed in front of a listed building are a consideration. And as far as I'm concerned, they materially distract from the beauty of the building that we have there. Also, I'm concerned that in the picture on page 9, the picture as you showed it to us, the proposed new building, we don't know what it's going to look like in terms of, there's a description of it, but it would have been nice to see a coloured representation so that you could judge the impact on the listed building. So I have to say I'm still not able to determine whether I think it's detracting from this listed building or not. On what I've seen so far, it doesn't look very good. And I think I will probably be therefore objecting or not supporting the grant or the proposed granting or the recommendation to grant permission. Thank you.
Can I ask? Sorry, let's come on to Councillor Costa in a second. In the context of this, of the listed building, the effect on the building, obviously drilling holes into it and putting trunking on it is clearly in effect. Is it only physical changes to the structure that we are being asked to comment on? There's nothing else in terms of, as Councillor Martin said, in terms of setting or items going in front of the building. That's not a matter for tonight. Is that correct?
To confirm, bollards would be a permitted development work for the applicant. A number of classes of permitted development exclude works within the setting of a listed building, but that does not apply to this class of permitted development. In effect, the physical works are what we're looking at. In my report, I note that there can sometimes with listed buildings be a consideration as to if you think a change of the use would materially impact upon the significance of the asset. So in my report I've discussed whether there is potential for the shutting off of the ticket hall onto the platform, and therefore the loss of the ticket hall as a thoroughfare would materially impact on the significance of the asset, but I don't think that would be the case, particularly given that the main ticket buying area would remain within the building, so it would still be extensively used by passengers. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cossell.
Thank you very much. I do understand the limitations as to what we can actually make judgment on this evening, but I do think as a Godalming councillor and someone who actually used the station almost every day for 17 years and continues to do so, and on behalf of our constituents, I very much share the thought that Paul Follows offered just now. I do think even if we can't formally make the concerns expressed as part of this application, we really ought to make a plea. There are people here to listen to us today, and maybe we can do it in other ways about the ridiculous proposal to not allow access on the other side of the station. It's going to cause a lot of difficulty, and I hope people will listen to us as representatives of the community on that particular point. Interestingly, I was also going to, Councillor Martin was way ahead of me, going to ask about whether the parking was going to be affected. I actually dropped my wife off there, she's off on holiday for a week, just this Monday, and those few spaces, they are only few, but they are really vital. There's quite a churn there of people coming in, dropping off and so on. So I hope the assurances we've been given are accurate, because any diminution of parking in that area, I think will cause significant problems for the area. Final point I wanted to ask, Chairman, there's a procedural point here, and I don't know if the planners can take this away. I was disappointed to hear that when we have a speaker at this committee, because this is my first time here at this committee, we don't have even a limited opportunity to ask questions of them. I have sat on planning committees in other councils, and I have sat on other committees where there have been limited opportunities to ask questions, and I think sometimes that adds significantly to our understanding of the points being made to us, and I hope the new administration could have a look at that point. And if I had been able to ask a question, just sheer intrigue, I would have wanted to know why the government has identified Godalming as one of 13 stations that need ticket barriers. Whether it's got something to do with the honesty of people in Godalming or other things, I really don't know, but it'd be quite nice to know what the answer to that question is.
I'm sure you will find a way of asking the appropriate people at some point. Thank you. Yeah, and I certainly would encourage members to write in their capacity as Godalming councillors, or indeed get in communication with the authorities to make sure they're aware of the views of people in Godalming, even though it may not be material to this application. Okay.
Chair, I would be more than happy to write as head of service outside the remit of this application in front of us with a separate letter outlining some concerns and matters that members might like to raise.
That would be very welcome. Thank you. Sorry,
I'd just like to say that my own feelings are I am sorry for the people of Godalming that we do not have more input into what is happening to our station. And I hope that we can get that through to them, that it is totally out of our hands.
So, I mean, clearly it's a matter that I think everybody, the officer and also councillors should be in communication with the railway authorities. It's clearly a matter of interest to people in Godalming. Councillor Williams.
Yes, and I'm not sure whether this is a material consideration, and I would welcome advice on this, because it appears to me that if one restricts parking at stations, the ironic consequence of that is that actually you increase the likelihood of more traffic flow taking place, because clearly you are discouraging people from using a form of public transport rather than private transport. And it seems somewhat ironic that there is a proposal from the railway authorities that actually the amount of parking that is available, the short-term parking that is easily available for users of the station, is actually being diminished. So I would sort of welcome any comments on that from a planning perspective. And clearly the other issue, which is of concern, which needs to be noted, I think, in any case, whether or not it is actually a planning matter, is that by requiring commuters and others to use another access rather than the bridge, will actually be requiring people to use what is actually quite a dangerous roadway, and therefore that is something which has concerns from a road safety perspective, and I would welcome any comments on that from a planning perspective. But if there is no planning basis for that as a means of objection, then I would hope that those points would be noted and would be taken to the applicant.
Yes, I mean, the latter of those points in relation to the safety of the road access, it is noticed that is a concern for residents, and whilst that matter hasn't been assessed from a safety perspective, it's not something which we unfortunately have any control over with this application. So in effect, the access could be closed off without any consent from us. And equally, the changes to the car parking to the front of the forecourt aren't something which need a consent from us. And whilst we have a very strongly worded emerging policy in the Godalming and Farncombe neighbourhood plan, which I've certainly noted is there, and when we do have control of the matter, that is certainly something we'll be looking to achieve. Unfortunately, within the remit of this application, it's not something we can control at all.
Councillor follows, but try and stick to the point of
very specific to this point then. So preserve and enhance the character of the listed building being the two particular criteria that we're talking about here. So can you talk to us a little bit about the material and the coverings of the ducting that's going to be covering all these cables, the impact visually of the locks and the other mechanisms and the signage in terms of how that detracts from or enhances or preserves the building in this particular context?
Yes, I can. So the requirement is to preserve or enhance.
Yeah.
If I just take the slideshow back to the images. And specifically in relation to the internal elevation, this is what we've been provided with. So it would, in effect, for the predominant length of the conduit would be just the cables themselves, rather than, I know that there's some quite significant silver trunking already in place, but that wouldn't be the case with what's proposed here. It's that, as shown in the elevation here. And equally, the door locking mechanisms themselves would be what you see here. in terms of the scale of the building itself.
Yes, Beth.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to provide Councillor Follows with some comfort, condition 1 that is being proposed, it speaks of all building works, finishes and making good, both internal and external, shall match the relevant existing work in respect of detail and finished appearance unless otherwise approved in writing by the local planning authority. So there is an element of protection there. If you were minded, if you wanted to perhaps afford it slightly more protection, there is a possibility we could reword the condition so that all finishes could be approved by the local planning authority.
I actually haven't done this for a long time. I would like to do that. What's the mechanism for me to do that? Yes, I would propose that amendment so that we can have more strict control over what they're doing in terms of the finish.
Thank you. Unless anyone wants to speak on the amendment, then shall we go to a vote on the amendment? So those in favour of the amendment?
That's 11, Chairman.
Did you count me?
I did, yes. That's just Councillor Sam.
Any against?
None, Chairman.
Any abstentions?
1, Chairman.
Okay, so that amendment is carried. So are there any other speakers on this matter before we go to voting on the recommendations? Okay. In which case we have 4 recommendations. The first one has been amended.
It's all one. So
Indeed so. Yeah, indeed. Now, can we be absolutely clear about, do we know what the first one now reads? Can we have some rough wording as to what? So, I guess at the end of the first condition, it says unless otherwise approved in writing by the local planning authority. So, it should say as to be agreed with the.
If you just say amended condition number 1, subject to conditions 2 to 4 and amended condition number 1 and informative number 1 listed building consent be granted.
Yeah, I was making sure we understand what the amendment actually was. Yeah, we are. It's clear.
I would just suggest removing the words shall match the relevant existing work, and then we've got free rein over what we can actually require of them. All building works, finishes and making good, both internal and external, shall be carried out in the respective method, detail and finished appearance shall be carried out in a manner approved by the local planning authority.
Yep, okay, that's clear. Okay, so we have that, as Councillor Ells said, we have amended condition 1.
Sorry.
So, Beth again, carry on.
Thank you, Chairman, sorry. Should have said, as part of that condition, we can require details at a scale of 1 to 10 to be provided to aid the understanding of what has been proposed.
Do you require that to be said now, or can you? Is that a detail?
That's something we can put in.
Okay, right.
Chairman.
Okay, in which case.
Excuse me, can I? Thank you, Chairman. I would find that a bit pernickety, isn't it, to scale of 1 to 10 details of some conduit and a couple of switches. Seems slightly over the top. That's just my comment.
I will leave the officers to decide how much information they really have to get out of from the applicant. But I think the intent of the committee is clear that we don't, because it said before it was to match existing work, some of which we don't like. So even when they came back and matched the bad stuff, then which is why we've amended it. So I think you're clear about what the intention is.
I think with your discretion, Chairman, if you delegate the wording of the condition to officers taking on board all the comments tonight, that would be appreciated.
Well, that's okay with me, if that's okay with the committee. Agreed. Okay. Right, thank you. In which case we have amended condition 1, and then 2, 3 and 4, and 1 informative to accept. Do we accept those well, yeah. So those in favour of that?
That's 10, Chairman.
Those against?
None, Chairman.
Any abstentions?
2,
Two.
Chairman.
Okay. The second item, which right. So this is the land at Branscombe House, Filmer Grove, Godalming. Erection of a building to provide 3 dwellings with associated parking, bin storage, cycle storage, and landscaping. And Beth Dovey to present. Beth, did I say Beth? Ruth, sorry.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, members. So the application relates to Branksome House, which is located on the north side of Filmer Grove. The existing building is a large 4-storey Victorian building, which you can just see in the aerial here, and it's currently occupied as offices. On the eastern side of the building, it's laid to car parking, and on the western side is garden area, and you can see from the aerial that there are substantial mature trees that surround the site, some of which are TPO'd, so there's a group of TPO'd trees here, and then there are 5 TPO'd trees along the southern boundary of the site. The northeastern boundary of the site abuts the railway line, which is here, and you can see from the aerial on the eastern boundary of the site the rear gardens of Nightingale Road. Sorry? Oh, sorry. Thank you. Apologies. That should be better.
Check out closely.
If you do the view slideshow bit, do you want me to do it?
Where?
At the bottom right.
Right, that one? This one? That one?
One more. Next one. The one that's like a little screen.
Right, excellent. Right, we got there, sorry. So Filmer Grove itself provides residential accommodation on its southern side, and the site is within the developed area of Godalming. So this just provides you with a bit more context of the actual site itself. So this is the site entrance here. So this is the view, this is the entrance here, so this is the view looking towards the building in this direction. This is just slightly further in to the site, so you can just see the eastern elevation here, which is this elevation here, and this is a view taken towards the rear of the site and shows part of the boundary with the properties on Nightingale Road. And then this gives you a better idea of what the eastern elevation of the building actually looks like. So this shows the existing, this is the existing block plan. So you've got the building sitting here, and this just shows all the car parking adjacent to it. And this is the eastern elevation that we've just seen on the photo on the previous slide. There is a bit of history to this site, which is quite relevant to the consideration of the application. So there have been a number of prior approval applications on this site for the change of use of the offices to residential accommodation. So there are 3 particular applications in this respect, one for 11 dwellings, one for 12 dwellings, and the most recent for 17 dwellings. So effectively, the existing building that I've been showing you would be converted to offices, and this block plan just shows amendments to the layout of the car parking in order to achieve that. So on the previous block plan, there was car parking that went up into here.
Clarification, surely it's conversion from offices to residential, not to offices.
Sorry, yes, sorry, from offices to residential. Thanks for that clarification. So within that context, this proposal is for the provision of 3 three-bedroom townhouses in the northern part of the site. So on this part of the site here, and this would be carried out in conjunction with the use of the existing building for occupation by 17 dwellings. So these are the proposed elevations of the dwellings. They would be 3 stories in height, and each of them would have a front and rear garden. I'll just go back to the previous slide where you can see the front and rear gardens. You note here this eastern boundary tapers, so the dwellings sit, the gap between the proposed building and the eastern boundary is between 5.4 and 3.7 metres, with the rear gardens of the properties in Nightingale Road. And the length of gardens of the properties in Nightingale Road are approximately 35 metres. The proposal also includes bin and bike stores. So, sorry, that's the proposed elevations. So this is the southern elevation, which is the front elevation, and this is the rear elevation. The eastern elevation is the elevation that faces onto the rear gardens of Nightingale Road. These are the proposed floor plans. And then within the gardens of each of the dwellings, you would have a bike store. And in addition to this, it's also proposed to provide a communal bike store for the flats that have been approved under the prior notification for the provision of 17 bikes, and also a bin store that would be situated close to the access to the site, and these are the elevations of those. The proposal also will involve the rearrangement of car parking spaces within this area here in order to ensure that sufficient car parking is provided for the flats and the new dwellings. So there is further relevant history to this site, which comprises an application that was refused in August 2018 for an alternative scheme, which was an application for the erection of 9 flats in the same location with associated parking, bin and cycle storage. This application was recommended for approval by officers, but refused by the Planning Committee on the grounds of lack of suitable amenity space, substandard living accommodation for future occupiers. The proposed units fell foul of the internal space standards. It was considered that there was insufficient amenity space provision for all the units across the entire site, and that there was an unacceptable relationship between the two blocks of flats. So between that subject to the prior notification and block of flats that was proposed to the north of the site. I'm just going to...
So I guess our question on that last one, are those to scale? On the left and the right, are those in scale?
No, apologies for that. They are not to scale. So, okay. But I should have something later on in the presentation that shows an outline of the appeal scheme set against the current scheme. So the previous application was also refused on the grounds that there was a conflict between the office use and the proposed new residential use, but that was only on the basis that because we were refusing that planning application, then we couldn't secure the prior notification residential units to be carried out at the same time as the dwellings that are proposed, if that makes sense. But that reason for refusal could be overcome with this proposed scheme, because if councillors were minded to approve it, then the proposal would be subject to a Section 106 agreement that would require the prior notification scheme to be undertaken before these dwellings are done, and therefore you don't have the issue about the incompatibility of the uses. So this slide here shows comparative elevations of the appeal scheme, which is on the left-hand side, and the proposed elevations that are before you this evening. And this gives you some indication of the difference in scale between the two schemes, with that outlined in red being the scheme that is subject to appeal at the moment. And then I just have some figures here in terms of comparative heights. So the appeal scheme is 11.73 metres in height. That proposed is 10.04. The appeal scheme width was 21.46, and the width of the building has been reduced to 16.33. And the depth, we've gone from 15.29 to 11.51. And we've, as a result of the reduction in the width, we've seen the building come away from the boundary. So now at its closest point, it sits 3.7 metres away. So the key issues in the consideration of this application is the compatibility of the uses, and that would be addressed through the provision of Section 106 agreement to ensure that the prior notification use is undertaken. The quality of accommodation, previously the proposed flats did not accord with the nationally described space standards. These 3 units, proposed units, now do in terms of both bedroom size and overall floor area. And officers are also satisfied that there is the appropriate level of outdoor amenity space provision for the residential units and also across the site as a whole. With regard to overlooking between the 2 buildings, the applicants have advised, I'll just take you back to let me just take you back. So the applicants have advised that they would be willing to obscurely glaze the lower elements of these windows in the existing building to ensure that there would be no harmful overlooking. In addition to that, there is a condition that officers are recommending as part of the proposals to obscurely glaze these sides of the bay windows in the proposed new dwellings to further ensure that there would be no overlooking. So on that basis, we feel satisfied that there would be no harmful overlooking between the dwellings in the existing building and the proposed new dwellings. With regard to design, officers are of the view that the proposal is acceptable in design terms. The new building would be subordinate to the main building and picks up design references such as feature gables that can be found on the main building. And we're satisfied that there's sufficient space around the building to ensure they don't appear cramped and crowded. Another key consideration, sorry, I feel like I'm jumping around slightly, is impact on neighbours, and for quite detailed reasons set out in the officer's report. Officer of the view that there wouldn't be any harmful impact on neighbouring residents, and I think this is particularly because of the long gardens that the properties on Nightingale Road have. We've also considered the car parking provision across the entire scheme, and are satisfied that that would be sufficient and in accordance with the council's standards. One of the possibly more sensitive issues is the matter of trees, because the council's tree officer has advised that as a result of the arrangement of the car parking and the need for a bit more hard standing, that 2 off-site sycamores might be impacted by the increase in parking provision and 1 beech tree, and it is recognised that this is a negative that needs to be weighed into the balance of the overall proposal and the benefits of the housing provided. That said, this was an issue that was flagged up on the appeal scheme, and it didn't form a reason for refusal on the appeal scheme. So it would be difficult for that to form a reason for refusal for this application. You will have had a written update sheet circulated to you. I've also got a verbal update because condition 18 on the agenda talks about the 3 new dwellings being installed with fast charge sockets. Officers are actually proposing that condition is amended and say that all of the car parking spaces within the development are provided with fast charge sockets. And the other verbal update is just with reference to an error on page 32 of the report on the third paragraph down, where officers have advised that the closest point of the building is 5 metres from the boundary, but it's actually 3.7 metres, which I've tried to cover off in the presentation. So officers are recommending approval of the application.
Right, thank you. Okay, we have two speakers, 4 minutes each, to speak about on the application. The first is Julian Gall, who's going to object. So we'll try and give you 1 minute notice if you're still going through.
My wife and I have lived at number 7 Nightingale Road for nearly 30 years. This evening I'm speaking on behalf of the residents of numbers 7, 9, 11 and 13, who are the people most affected by this development. We and other local residents have submitted objections to this application. As many of the councillors on the committee may be unfamiliar with the history of the development, I'd like to give you a brief summary. Branksome House is a Bargate stone Victorian building which was originally a school. In recent years, it has been offices. In late 2017, an application was submitted to convert the building to 11 flats. No Nightingale Road residents objected to the change of use, which did not seem unreasonable. The application emphasised that no changes were proposed to the nature of the site, which retained all its vegetation and its mature trees, and that no increase in the amount of parking would be required. After planning permission had been granted for the conversion, a team arrived in December 2017 and felled the most significant tree on the whole site, a healthy, mature horse chestnut. When, in early 2018, we were notified of a further planning application to build a large new building with 9 flats in the car park, it became all too apparent to us why this tree had been removed. It would certainly have received a preservation order had the application for the new building been submitted at the time of the application for the conversion. Briefly, the original proposal for this new 9-flat block was refused. A subsequent change, which retained the 9 flats but removed undercroft parking, was refused and is now at appeal. We now have the plans that are the subject of this meeting for 3 houses. Also, the number of flats proposed for the Branksome House conversion has risen in stages from the original 11 to 17 in an application last October. There is no time to go in detail into the report pack for this meeting, but we take issue with a comment on page 33 that the loss of light is not sufficiently material to warrant refusal. The proposed building would, due to its 3-storey height, block the sunlight in the rear gardens from late afternoon to the end of the day, the peak time for families with young children to be outside during the week. To summarise, we would like to emphasise the overbearing, excessive and unsustainable nature of this development. Nightingale Road properties will be overlooked by the houses, as will the converted flats in Branksome House. The Brownfield Site Register originally listed this site as suitable for 9 dwellings. After a reasonable first proposal for the conversion to 11 flats, the total number of dwellings proposed is now 20, including the 3 houses, more than double the original register expectation. Mature trees and natural ground cover forming wildlife corridors and nesting sites have been or are proposed to be torn out. The conversion of Branksome House to flats could itself provide high-quality accommodation in a graceful old building with ample car parking and a pleasant green environment. The removal of the horse chestnut could be mitigated by making the area a shared garden for the flats, whereas to add this further building will change the character completely, with cars crammed into too little space and a development that is mostly a car park with little greenery and difficult access to the buildings that adjoin it. We hope you will reject this application.
Okay, similarly, you've got 4 minutes. I think a bleep goes at 30 seconds.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight at the committee. I'm Megan Rowe and I'm the planning consultant at C7 Architects, and I'm speaking on behalf of our clients, Lennox Estates Limited. I've prepared something to say, but having listened to what's been said before, I think I'll just run through the pertinent points. First of all, I want to reiterate that the application is for the 3 dwellings, which is recommended for approval by your officers. The comparative plans will have shown that the scale of the 3 dwellings is far reduced to what the previous proposal was proposing, both in terms of height and footprint and width. And during the process of the appeal for the larger scheme, I want to point out that we did submit a unilateral undertaking with regard to the conflict of uses and the obscure glazing, and that went through the process with the legal department, and the issue regarding, or that reason for refusal was withdrawn during the appeals process. So we've submitted the same but amended version of that unilateral undertaking already, and that should be with the legal department being dealt with at the moment. I'd also like to point out that our client purchased the site after the works to the trees were carried out. They bought the site after that had happened. That was a previous developer who did that. And the tree protection plan will show that the area that the objector referred to is a very small area along the eastern boundary, and the proposal includes specific tree works, specific groundworks that would avoid impacting on those trees and which would maintain the health of those trees in the long run. Having heard what Ruth has just said about wanting the provision of charging points for every car parking space, I think my client would probably question whether that was a reasonable condition, considering we're just proposing the 3 houses here. I don't know if there's a policy background for why that's proposed, so maybe the officer could clarify that for us. I'd also like to reiterate that it's been demonstrated that the separation distance between the building and the boundary has been increased significantly, and officers have concluded that the impact on amenity would not detrimentally harm the neighbours in Nightingale Road. There's sufficient parking available on site for both buildings, and as I say, the Section 106 has already been submitted, and we do appreciate the points raised by the neighbours, but we have worked hard on this application and throughout the life of the previous one to overcome those, and we therefore request that you follow your officer's recommendation and resolve to approve the application. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So you've seen recommendations. Anyone want to speak? Councillor Cossa.
This application is in my ward. I think the first decision I was asked to take as a councillor in May was whether I wanted this to come to committee because of the number of representations, and I did ask that it come to committee. And having read the report and having listened, I'm glad that I did. I mean, my reason for wanting it to come here was because I was obviously aware of the whole background to this site and the fact that there had been a prior application, and I wanted to understand what differences there were as between the two. But principally, I was concerned, obviously, as a ward councillor, about the continuing concerns of residents, some of which we've heard here this evening in Nightingale Road. Having read the officer report and having listened, I'll be quite honest. There's some particular issues I want to raise, but I'll be quite honest and say I find myself in real difficulty on this application, in that I do think there are some substantial concerns about the application. On the other hand, I do accept quite a lot of the points made by the officers about the way in which this application is different to the previous one and the way that some of those concerns have been mitigated. I'd like, before I forget, to raise some specific questions and concerns with which I did talk to the planning officer in advance, so they had some advance notice of this. My first concern, obviously, is about the trees. Clearly, I don't think we're in the business of losing more trees if we can possibly help it anywhere, frankly. This has got a strange history, this site. One of the trees seems to have disappeared, and I understand it may not be the culpability of the existing owner, but before anything actually even happened there in rather strange circumstances. And I'm really concerned about loss of trees generally in this area. The report itself and our officers, I think, properly recognise that this is a negative factor as far as this application is concerned. And I think as a committee, we're going to have to decide how important that is relative to the other issues that have been raised. I'd like to raise two other issues which possibly minor, but they seem to me to have been raised and I couldn't find any obvious response to them in the report. There was an issue raised, I think, by the residents about bats. I have to say I hold no brief for bats. They're pesky creatures as far as I'm concerned. But whilst we have wildlife habitats and things to protect, there are some concerns around this that we're expected to address. And I would just like the officers to tell me whether they have taken on board those points. And secondly, and I think this is probably a technical issue, the other thing I noticed residents had raised was some issues about drainage and so on. And I think what the report said was something along the lines of, well, this isn't a big enough application to actually deal with that. It would just be dealt with as part of the building. And I sort of suspect that must be right legally, but I don't find it terribly satisfactory, and I'd just like some more explanation from officers as to what the position is in relation to that. And I'm sorry if it has been addressed and I've missed it, but I'm raising the issues that are of import to me. I think in summary, what I'd like to say is this. I find myself convinced by a number of things that the officer said. This is a much smaller application, and I do think that diminishes to some extent some of the concerns that have been raised about overlooking, about size and about bulk and that sort of thing. And I do think that overall there's a pretty thorough analysis here by our officers which describes the ways in which, in planning terms, the application might be regarded as acceptable if we don't give sufficient weight to some of the negative factors like the trees. But I do find myself still unconvinced, partly because of the trees, but partly because I do actually, I think, understand and empathise with those whose gardens, not as much as before, and not in terms of their whole garden, but will have that light and so on impinged and impaired for them. So I stand at the moment, Chairman, undecided which way I'm going to cast my vote. I'd like to hear the views of other members of the committee, but I do retain some concerns. Thank you.
I should have said at the start, we're trying to hold each speaker for 4 minutes. You're a little bit over, but not much over. Yeah, but okay. But anyway, Councillor Williams.
Yes, I went to visit the site this afternoon, and given the weather conditions, it was certainly difficult to see whether there would be any obscuring of light, because the conditions today were not exactly sunny. However, it did strike me that the position of the proposed development, and I was not part of the process where the original application was discussed by this committee, but it did seem to me that in terms of the issue of overshadowing the gardens in Nightingale Road is not significantly addressed in terms of the shadows that would be cast by buildings of the height that they are, in terms of the gardens of 7, 9, 11 and 13 Nightingale Road. The officer did suggest that the length of the gardens was such that the buildings were a distance away from the boundary between the Branksome House property and the properties on Nightingale Road. The longest garden is the garden of 13 Nightingale Road, which was where I was actually viewing the proposed development site from. And actually there, you do find that there is a building that is separate from the main building of the house, which is a building which would be overlooked by the new development. And I don't think that, you know, that is something that potentially could be questioned, and I'd be grateful of any comments on that from officers. The other issue the other question that I would like to ask is that we are looking at a baseline of 17 dwellings with attendant parking associated with them, which is, you know, the starting point of this application. I don't see any additional parking spaces in the new application that are making additional provision for the new dwelling. Clearly, I share Councillor Coss's concern about the removal of mature trees, which is necessitated by this site, and that is something which I think we do need to take into consideration. So I'd be grateful certainly of the comments particularly in terms of overlooking, because there are 3 buildings. Well, there are 3 sets of buildings here that we are looking at. One is the actual new flats, the Branksome House and the flats in Branksome House, which do overlook the new dwellings, or the new dwellings are rather overlooked by the buildings in Branksome House. There are also the fact that the new buildings are also overlooked by the existing Nightingale Road buildings, and they also overlook the existing buildings in Nightingale Road. So it's as it were, there are 3 sets of buildings here where there is a problem of overlooking, and I'd be grateful of any comments on that.
Can I just have 2 questions? Let's take the answers. First, about Councillor Costa's points on trees, bats and flooding, wasn't it?
Yeah, so actually, what I'll do is just clarify exactly what is happening in relation to trees, so everyone's clear. So there would be, I'm just trying to think what the best. So there would be 4 trees that would be removed on the eastern boundary. Now, when we're considering whether it's acceptable to remove trees or not, we have to consider their public amenity value. So the tree officer has considered this proposal in its totality and hasn't raised any concern regarding the removal of those 4 trees on the eastern boundary. Then we come to the matter of 3 trees that are a point of concern that aren't proposed to be removed, but because of the additional area for car parking, the tree officer has raised concern about their impact, and they are in the south. They are down in this corner of the site. So when we assess an application and the impact on trees, we don't have a planning policy that says that trees cannot come down per se. You have to assess the value and the visual amenity and the public visual amenity of those trees. So the tree officer has not raised concern about 4 proposed to be removed, but there is concern about 3 that are proposed to be retained and the relationship of those trees to the increased hard standing that is proposed. So next, in relation to bats, the site's in the developed area, and we have certain circumstances in which we consult Surrey Wildlife Trust on planning applications. This application doesn't meet those requirements, and therefore Surrey Wildlife Trust have not been consulted in this particular respect. And officers would feel satisfied that the proposal wouldn't be harmful in respect to biodiversity. Again, with drainage, the size of the application is such that we wouldn't consult the lead local flood authority. They are a consultant when the proposal is for 10 dwellings or more. I know that holistically, if you take everything together, this proposal is for, you end up with 20 dwellings on the site, but the reality is this planning application is for 3 dwellings. So in that respect, we haven't sought advice from the lead local flood authority given the size of the planning application. Shall I touch on a couple of other points?
Yes,
that were...
Councillor Williams, we had parking and overlooking, I think, with the 2 measures.
So in terms of the car parking provision, in all honesty, I haven't totaled up how many car parking spaces there are in the prior notification and how many as proposed, but what we're satisfied of is that when you take the existing building that's going to have 17 units and take into account the size of those units in terms of bedroom sizes, coupled with the 3 proposed new dwellings, that there is sufficient car parking on the site to meet our car parking standards. Whether it's not really a question of whether they're proposing more car parking or not, it's whether when you take the proposal as a whole for the 20 units and given the size of those units, whether it meets the car parking standards, and it does. And finally, just with regards to the concern about overlooking, I'm just going to try and find a slide to best demonstrate demonstrate why officers think it is acceptable. So you've raised concerns regarding overlooking between the existing building and the properties in Nightingale Road. I don't know what the exact distance is between this eastern elevation here and the rear of these dwellings here, but that would undoubtedly meet our our window-to-window separation distances, which is 21 metres, because the gardens in Nightingale Road are over 30 metres. In respect of the relationship between this building here and these units here, because they're perpendicular to each other, it means that even without the proposed obscure glazing, although they're quite close to each other, the angle of view would mean that it would be quite difficult to see clearly into the windows. But coupled with that, we do have the provision that some of the windows in the existing building subject to prior notification would be obscurely glazed, as would some of the panes within the proposed bay windows in the 3 new dwellings. So on that basis, we would be satisfied that there would be no harmful overlooking. And then I think your final point was about overlooking from the 3 new dwellings to the properties in Nightingale Road. So I think we acknowledge in the report that, that the relationship of this building and the properties in Nightingale Road is such that you might potentially be able to obtain views across the ends of the gardens of Nightingale Road, but that would really be the very ends of the gardens, and it would be an angled view. There is, if I take to so this is the proposed east elevation of the building, which would face the rear gardens of the properties in Nightingale Road. So there are no windows in the side elevation of that building other than this ground floor one. But there is screening at ground floor level along the boundary. And given the distances and the lengths of the garden, officers are satisfied that in that instance, there would also be no loss of privacy. So I hope that answers everyone's questions.
Councillor Follows. Around the people who are speaking first, then we'll come back to people who want to speak again. But yeah, I understand. Councillor Follows.
Thank you, Chair. One of the very few constants, absolutes I took from 18 months of sitting on two planning committees was that we should be reviewing these applications on their own, to their own merits. And we seem to have been, throughout a large portion of this presentation, been reviewing it against a different application, as opposed to whether this application is good in its own right or whether it's in fact better than the previous one that we've kicked. We haven't been really looking at it in that context. And just before I carry on, could you just clarify on that point before I ask a separate question?
Yeah, sorry, apologies if it's come across like that. I suppose I'm just trying to convey, there's history to the site that I feel like needs to be conveyed, and it is important that you see how the scheme has changed, and I did want to provide you with that information. And apologies if that has if I've over-egged that on the presentation. I haven't meant to, but effectively, if this were a standalone scheme and we didn't have the appeal scheme in the background, officers are satisfied that this is an acceptable scheme. If that answers your question.
It does. In practice, I just want to make sure that we're all talking about this as an independent thing rather than just agreeing it because it's less bad than a different application, which doesn't feel like what we should be doing. But I entirely accept where you're coming from that. I'm first off glad that Councillors Costers and Williams went first, because I think they've actually highlighted what sort of the sum of what I wanted to quickly ask about, which was this presumption in favour of sustainable development. And I was curious as to which aspects of it were sustainable, in that there is trees being lost, rather a lot of concrete, housing that seems to go above and beyond the context required for Godalming, considering the housing that's already got extant permission. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate on what exact elements of this are actually sustainable before I go on. Thank you.
Can we, I think Paul was going to make a point on the first thing first, then we'll deal with the second point.
Well, I think we actually did put the point. I just wanted to emphasise that in terms of the determination of the application, it is based on what is in front of you. In terms of determination of the application, it is based on what's in front of you in relation to this application, and not in the context of a better than what the previous point. In relation to trees, the officer's report, page 35, picks up the tree details and covers that off. And also in relation to car parking, that's covered on page 34 of the officer's report as well. Thanks.
Do you not have to demonstrate a positive sustainability, though, as opposed to just say it won't be harmful?
That's the second point, I think.
Yeah.
Ruth, do you want to deal with that?
Well, I suppose, I mean, sustainability is an interesting question. Sustainability covers many aspects, but essentially, I suppose if we're talking about why we consider this development sustainable, it's because it's within the developed area of Godalming. It's in close proximity to the town centre, to public, to shops and amenities and public services, and also proximity to public transport. So in that respect, it ticks the sustainability box. And in terms of Godalming and whether it's meeting its housing allocations, it's not just a case of in planning terms, you can't just say, right, we're not going to approve this development because we've met our housing allocations. If the development is actually acceptable in its own right, then whether Godalming is meeting its housing allocations or not is not really a factor in the consideration. But then if you factor in the wider consideration for the borough, there is a wider housing need that this fulfills. So that becomes a benefit that you add into the melting pot, essentially. So I hope that's a clear answer.
And my very, very final point on this particular one, and particularly after following that comment, could you comment on the objector's note regarding the allocation of the brownfield site and the number of houses it was designed or allocated to take, which it does appear to be somewhat in excess of that when you consider everything that's going on the plot. That doesn't feel sustainable if we allocated it for a lower number in the first place.
Yeah, again, I mean, apologies, I can't give you any background on the housing allocation because I wasn't involved in that, but all I can say is that we've got a scheme before us this evening and we have to assess whether we think it's acceptable or not, irrespective of what the housing allocation said. And in our view, the proposal is acceptable.
I've got Councillor David Ellis and then Councillor Penrivers.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, some more points of clarification, if I may. Could we go back to the coloured site plan, please? Yeah, how is the central unit going to get access to their rear garden? Or are they going to take their grass cuttings through the house?
I presume just like a terraced property where they don't. I mean, there are many terraced properties that don't have direct access to their back garden down the side of the dwelling.
There's plenty of Victorian terraces, but modern terraces tend to have a rear access path, don't they? Certainly in my 50-some-odd years of designing housing estates, I've always included a rear access to every house. I mean, they've got a bike store in the back garden, so they're going to have to take their bikes through the house as well, aren't they? And all muddy and dirty on a day like today. But what I'm thinking is that it'll probably end up with a rear footpath running alongside the boundary, which is going to reduce that left-hand unit. Isn't really going to have a rear garden worth talking about. Anyway, can I move on to something else? I do have a concern about the amenity area of them generally, but the charging points, you mentioned that you'd be insisting on them for every parking space. Do we have the power to do that? If we're judging this one on its merits, I mean, it's a bit like saying to Oxford Ridge, OK, that's all owned by Waverley, so every house up there has got to have a new charging point, whether it's been there for 100 years or not. I'm a bit mystified on that, but I'll come back to that. And then lastly, car parking. Page 35, you say that there would be sufficient space on site to provide 31 spaces, which I'm sure you're quite right, but we don't seem to have a condition to cover that point, that they shall submit any sort of scheme to show how they're going to and where they're going to provide those 31 spaces. Thank you.
Do you want to take those points now?
Okay, so with regard to the charging points, I might just take you back actually to the prior notification. So originally, the prior notification application for the 17 units had a condition on it that required 20% of the available car parking spaces to be to have a charging socket. Certainly it tends to be the case these in the current climate that we do require 100% of car parking spaces to have vehicle charging sockets, and I suppose the rationale for whether that is reasonable or not is on the basis that the car parking effectively has to be amended in this scheme because of the provision of the three dwellings. So that's the rationale behind the 100% vehicle charging socket condition.
Car parking layout.
Yeah, so in terms of the car parking layout, we should have a plan. So the car parking is detailed on this coloured up plan. And I think we have a condition to say, let me just check. I'm pretty sure there's a condition somewhere to say the car parking. If there isn't, we can add one. Oh, right, okay. I have to say, I thought there was one, but... No, I think you're right. Oh, hold on. No, condition 7. The development hereby approved shall not be first occupied unless and until space has been laid out within the site in accordance with the approved plans for the parking of vehicles. So there is a condition there would be a condition on the decision if the committee were minded to approve it, to require the developer to provide the car parking in accordance with the plans.
So there are 31 spaces shown on the site plan, are there?
As far as I'm aware, yes.
Okay, good, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Henry Rivers. Oh, sorry, Beth, you're trying to get in earlier.
Sorry, Chairman, it's just because I know I'm going to forget otherwise. Whilst we're on the subject of conditions, we were talking about the fenestration on the eastern elevation and the potential for overlooking. I have just noticed that we don't actually have a condition proposed that would restrict permitted development rights for windows at first floor level and above and in roof slopes on that eastern elevation. So if I would personally recommend that if you were minded to grant permission, that condition be imposed also. Thank you, Chairman.
Councillor Rivers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm new to this committee, and I'm familiar with the site. I do a monthly communion at Eastlake, and we often park very near and sometimes have to turn the car in the car park, so I'm very familiar with the site. I believe that we're looking at an application for 3 new houses in Godalming. That cannot be overdevelopment. There is room. The design looks to me to be very much in keeping with the original Branksome house. Perfectly all right, no objection there. The conditions deal with the car parking, so no objection there. Clearly, it doesn't overlook any Nightingale Road properties. Even the backs of the gardens are not overlooked, as has been shown. So I am minded to have no objection to this application. Thank you.
So we have two speakers who have already spoken. So should we get Councillor Costa first?
Brief, Chairman. Just wanted to come back on a couple of the responses I had to the points I'd raised. Just to go back briefly to the trees, I did just feel that perhaps in the explanation we had, the impression was rather given that the loss of trees would have fairly limited impact related just to the area itself rather than the wider area. But I would draw members' attention to the conclusions of officers in their own report on page 37 that does say, through the provision of parking, the development will result in a loss of trees which would be to the detriment of the wider visual amenity of the area. That is the conclusion our officers have reached, and I think whatever decision we take, we should take account of that. On the drainage one, I just wanted to understand this. It is one site, and I understand there may be a limit to the number of dwellings there has to be before we refer to the flood authority, but can I therefore be assured that because the 3 doesn't trigger it, the wider permitted development thing will have caused an application to be made for it to be looked at by the flood authority, because otherwise it would be a bit of a nonsense, it seems to me.
Do you want to take those points, Ruth? Please.
I was just noting that the Section 1 and 6 agreement is mainly intended to link the developments. This is a slightly technical point. It's with regards to the surface drainage scheme, the SUDS. That will be dealt with by condition, so that we don't need to have a specification in the 1 and 6 agreement. But you can't condition the payment of money, and you have to provide for the maintenance of the SUDS in perpetuity. So the Section 1 and 6 agreement will pick that up. So it might be advisable to reflect the requirement for a SUDS scheme to be set out in the 1 and 6 agreement. There's no SUDS.
Just to clarify the position, that there isn't any sustainable urban drainage in relation to this application.
Well,
so
that's unusual.
Because it's for 3 units.
Well, with prior approval. Which is
under the terms of prior approval, you can consider flooding. So flooding would have been considered under the prior approval. I don't have to hand the exact details of what was considered under the prior approval. Just bear with me a second. Let me see if I can see something.
No, yeah.
Right, sorry for the delay. So, under the terms of the prior approval, there were no conditions in relating to flood risk. So they can provide 17 dwellings on the site without having any requirements towards flooding. So with that in mind, we really are just considering the 3 residential dwellings, and we would not consult with the lead local flood authority on the provision of 3 dwellings. It would have to be a more significant scale of development to trigger that consultation. And I appreciate the fact that obviously on the site in total there are going to be 20 dwellings, but it's difficult to include the 17 that were done, that were considered under the prior approval, because that was considered under a separate process where there are all sorts of factors that you can't take into account.
It seems to be as a function of the way it's organised.
So it's 10 or more units. Because the 17 is a prior notification application. So you can consider flood risk. You can't require sustainable urban drainage. Under a prior notification application, there are very few things you consider, and they're essentially flood risk, compatibility with surrounding uses, car parking, and there's another one that escapes me at the moment. So, but we can't require of a prior notification application all the things that we can require of a planning application effectively. So we have to factor in that the 17 dwellings on the site were done under a prior notification, and then it wouldn't be reasonable to apply conditions to that that you wouldn't apply to a prior notification scheme.
Councillor Williams.
Yes, it was really just to query this whole question, going back to the sort of car parking issue. And I mean, clearly I'm staggered if we haven't got electric charging points for every car parking space, unless we regard these buildings of a very temporary nature. However, in terms of the number of spaces, if we are judging the application on its own, then the baseline is that in the previous application, as I understand it, there are 31 car parking spaces. There are currently 31 car parking spaces. So the additional, this application is not providing any more. It's not providing any car parking spaces. That I mean, I may be new to this game in Waverley, but it does strike me that there is an issue here.
If it's true, I think you said before that there are enough spaces for both developments.
Yeah,
so
so
it's better to say it again so it's clear.
Effectively, the measure isn't. If I've understood your point correctly, there are a certain number of car parking spaces provided for the prior notification scheme. Is that what you're saying? And we're not increasing that number for the 3 dwellings. But under the terms of planning policy, that isn't the test. The test isn't whether there's an increase. The test is, it's just a blanket test of whether there is sufficient or not. So actually, you could argue, under the prior notification scheme, there was an oversupply of car parking relative to our car parking standards. And therefore, there isn't a requirement to provide more car parking spaces, provided that there are a sufficient number to accord with our car parking standards when you take into account the 3 new dwellings and the 17 in the prior notification scheme. Does that make sense?
Yeah, even though in the prior notification application, it was a balance of arguments that led to the approval. And so actually, we're not going back to the previous scheme, we're actually looking at a new application. Are we not?
Chair, if I may. Page 34 of the officer's report picks this matter up. The final paragraph on page 34. Under the considered prior approval scheme, it's a minimum of 23 car parking spaces. The proposed 3 additional units require 7.5 spaces, and that's rounded up to 31.
Yep. So there's enough provided over to cover the statutory requirements for the two schemes. Sorry, thank you very much. We've covered all the points that were raised. Is there anything else that the officers want to say? No? Okay. Yep. So in terms of the recommendation, let's be clear. In terms of we've added a couple more conditions. We're amending condition 18 with regard to the charging points for electric vehicles. Now, what is the change? We're changing it to what? Sorry, all of them. Okay, yes, thank you. And the second point is...
Sorry, Chair, can I just be elaborated on a little bit? So we're saying all 31 spaces are now going to... We're saying by condition we want them all to have electric car charging points. Can we actually do that? Don't get me wrong, I'd love to, but not only does it not, I don't believe we have the power to, but clearly the applicant's going to object, so that's going to get challenged anyway, so we might as well address this now.
Just to clarify, Chair, condition 18 relates to the 3 units, not the whole of the
So which of the 31 apply specifically to the 3?
No. There's 100% for those 3 units, so it's 3. And then there's 20% in relation to the prior approval.
It's 7.5 spaces for the 3 units. So you get 7 or 8 car parking charging points plus the 20% of the 20.
No, only be 1 for each unit. You only need 1 for each unit, don't you?
To be clear, it's related to the units, not the car parking spaces.
Okay. Councillor.
Sorry, at the bottom of page 34, it says that the proposed 3 additional units would require 7.5 spaces. So are we not saying that 8 spaces need to have charging points?
If I understand, it's the condition, well, someone say what the policy is.
But if the officers are saying that the 3 units require 7.5 spaces, then surely the condition should relate to those.
Would you mind repeating that point? Sorry.
I'm reading the bottom of page 34, where it says that the consented 17 dwellings would require a minimum of 23 parking spaces, and the proposed 3 additional units would require 7.5 spaces. So rounding up, surely there's 8 spaces that need the charging points plus 20% of the remainder.
We understand up here that the policy is it's 1 charging space point per unit, not per parking space, but can officers confirm that interpretation?
In terms of the condition that's been recommended by Highways for the dwellings, it would be 1 car parking socket per unit.
And just for my information, in terms of the original, sorry, what do you call it, the prior approval, what was the condition there for? Not that doesn't matter for this evening, but what was the condition there in terms of the number of charges?
So that was it was 20%, which is a minimum of 5 spaces.
It's done on 2 different ways for 2.
20% of the units.
Yeah. Or 20% of the...
So, sorry, I'll read the condition out. The development hereby approved should not be occupied unless and until 20% of the available parking spaces, a minimum of 5 spaces, are provided with a fast charge socket, current minimum to the requirements that we normally require, in accordance with the scheme to be submitted and approved in writing by the local planning authority and thereafter retained and maintained to the satisfaction of the local planning authority. A further 20% of available spaces, a minimum of 5 spaces, shall be provided with the power supply for future additional fast charge sockets with a feeder pillar or equivalent permitting future connection.
We start off with 20% which do have them, is that right?
Right, so we've got 20% or a minimum of 5 spaces that are provided with a fast charge socket.
Then 5 more that have the infrastructure,
Then
but
we've
not...
got a further 20%, a minimum of 5, that
Yep.
will be provided with the power supply for future additional fast charge sockets.
And that was the original, sorry, whatever you called it,
That is the 17-unit prior notification.
yeah, prior notification. And for this scheme, thinking about tonight, it's effectively 3 charging points to cover this 7.5 spaces that have been required. I hope that's clear. Is that clear? Right. Okay. In that case, so we'll amend the amendment to condition 18 then is to refer to the 3 charging points for this development. And the second one is the point that Beth raised about additional condition, removal of the rights for further development of windows in the first floor on, so first floor and above, yeah.
Sorry, Chairman, it's first floor above and roof slope on the eastern elevation.
Okay. Okay. With those modifications, we have the recommendation A slightly modified to include a condition, I guess, condition 20 and an amended condition 18, and informatives 1 to 7. So I guess we should vote on whether to accept that. Do we take them together or just take recommendation A first?
Take recommendation A.
Okay. Right, so recommendation A, those in favour, please show.
That's 6, Chairman.
Those against?
1, 2, 3, 4. That's 5, Chairman.
And those abstaining?
Should be 0. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor, can you turn off your mic? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so that was carried.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Recommendation B.
So recommendation B then. So in the absence of a completed Section 106 agreement within 6 months, the committee due date to ensure residential use of the site, that permission be refused. Those in favour of that recommendation?
That's 10, Chairman.
Those against?
None, Chairman.
Is that,
There should be one more.
so any abstentions?
One, Chairman.
One abstention. Okay. One. Thank you.
Gallery clear it.
Yeah. So we'll give it a second. So what's again? 65.
Councillor Martin left, so we had 12 to begin with. So Councillor Martin left.
I didn't see that. Well, what?
He just got off. I think possibly he had somewhere else to another meeting.
Perhaps they got the idea they had to go, but okay. Right, okay, thank you very much. Right, so move on to the last item, 9.4, 9 Rushcroft Farncombe, and erection, extension and alterations. And as you're aware, this is being brought to committee because of the, there's an officer involved or involved in, there's a partner of an officer is involved in this application. So, Ruth, do you want to introduce the item, please?
Thank you, Chair. This application relates to 9 Rushcroft. It's a terrace dwelling located in the developed area of Godalming, relatively modern in design. These are the photographs of the existing dwelling, and you can see that there is a garage here, and that is the most relevant bit to this planning application. This is another photograph that just shows a couple of other houses within the close, and the fact that they have front porches which project beyond the front building line, which is pertinent when we move on to the actual proposals themselves. So this is the proposed block plan. So effectively, the existing garage that you saw in the pictures comes to this point here and sits along the same point on the boundary with number 10, but the main difference is that it comes forward of the building line to extend the garage forward and also to provide a porch. So hopefully I've got so these are the elevations. These are the existing elevations. So if you look at the side elevation, this is the existing. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. This is the existing side elevation. The existing garage has, I mean, you perceive it as a flat roof from the front, but it's actually slightly sloping. So the proposal is to flatten that off, marginally increasing the height of it, and then bringing it forward here. And so this is how it translates onto the floor plans. So again, you can see an existing garage with a walkway in between the garage and the house here, and these are the proposals. So the key considerations are the design and the impact on visual amenity and the impact on residential amenity. So in terms of design, officers are satisfied. There's an existing almost flat roof garage in the same location, and effectively this just brings it slightly forward, and the property is relatively modern in terms of design, and officers of the view that it's the proposal is visually acceptable. With regards to impact on residential amenity, the height of the garage will be going up slightly as a result of flattening off the slope. but in terms of impact on neighbouring residents, there is a window in the side elevation of the neighbouring property, but that is a non-habitable room window. It serves a lobby area, so officers are satisfied that the very modest increase in height, coupled with the fact that the only window is non-habitable, means that the proposed development would not cause any overshadowing or loss of outlook. So officers are recommending approval of the application.
Thank you. Are there any questions from councillors? In that case, we can move on to vote. So recommendation number 1, that we, subject conditions 1 to 3, permission be granted. Those in favour, please.
That's unanimous, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Now, this original agenda, there were some items to do with, but is there anything after?
Yes, you can say there's no
Oh, sorry, yes, excuse me, sorry, read your notes. Okay, so there are no items to consider an exempt session, so that concludes this evening's meeting. Thank you very much.